I think that the Hormuz became kind of the center of gravity where this war's outcome in many ways will be determined. I think that this is kind of a weapon of mass destruction for Iran that they can use. It has some very negative effects. I think the administration was wise to impose a counter blockade and probably should have done it sooner to make sure that the rest of the world, including China, feels the pain as much as our trading partners and allies do. The idea that America doesn't need the Strait of Hormuz to be open simply because we have our own domestic oil supply, which in turn is priced globally, is a fantasy. Of course we need it to be open. We're going to talk about a global recession here, global demand destruction, including for the oil that the United States is producing, and basically, our partners' lives and livelihoods on the line. And now there is a hope, and I think it borders on fantastical, that China is going to deliver the rest of the region from Iran because they take their oil. Yeah. I don't see a lot of evidence that China is using that leverage with Iran anything other than very gently. Very gently. Perhaps if America was willing to make a huge trade and trade away other vital national interests in our defining competition with China in the 21st century, they would be willing to find some way to get it done with Iran.
Welcome to Oasis, the podcast of the Gulf International Forum. I'm David DeRoche, and today we have with us Daniel Benaim. He's the Senior Resident Fellow at the Middle East Institute, has a long history of government service, to include in the U.S. Senate, working for Senator Kerry on Senator Hillary Clinton's staff, the Clinton campaign, working as a speechwriter and a Middle East analyst in the Obama administration, in the Biden White House, and then finally as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula under President Joe Biden. We're going to talk about the big issues of the state, but I like to start by saying, how do you get there? You probably speak to a lot of student groups, and they always say, how do I get a job? So you went to the Dalton School and then on to Yale, and your degree was in English literature, and you worked on fractal geometry and the hints with literature. How did that work? And can you speak a little bit about the value of a humanities degree at a time when universities are like being viewed as trade schools?
Yeah, sure. Well, you've really done your homework. It's great to see you, and I really appreciate that. So the first thing I would say is that I would caution anybody listening not to try this at home. So I got into Middle East policy, I think in part from around the dinner table. My dad grew up in Tangiers, Morocco, and my mom's dad in Tehran, and they were very proudly American, and I grew up with very little by way of language, but a lot in terms of food, culture, history, and kind of that side of life with learning how to cook Persian rice, but not speaking Farsi, let's say, as the sort of quarter Persian part of my world. So how did I get there? Well, I was fell in love with Shakespeare and Chaucer and history and literature when I was in high school and college. These were things that really meant something to me. But as I got out of college and into the world, I graduated in the summer of 2001. As a native New Yorker, it was a pretty fateful time. When 9/11 happened, I was taking pre-med courses and considering becoming a doctor, which was another one of my early life interests. And I thought basically the most interesting thing that was happening in my world in that year was everything that I was reading about America and the Middle East, about our reactions, about the things that didn't seem quite right, about the cultures that I didn't totally understand. And something kind of fused with the family life that I'd had and the experiences and cultures and history that I had heard about, and then the things that were happening in the world where I said, this is actually a bit more interesting than the fetal pig that I'm dissecting or the organic chemistry that I'm doing. And this is actually where I want to be driving. That took me to the Fletcher School at Tufts, where I studied Middle East policy and U.S. foreign policy, which took me into a series of jobs in speechwriting. But I always wanted to be part of the foreign policy kitchen cabinet when I was doing those jobs. So I worked for John Kerry from 2006 to 2010 He took over the Foreign Relations Committee. We worked with Frank Lowenstein, who ended up being the Middle East Peace Envoy, and others, Heather Higginbottom, who ended up being the Deputy Secretary of State.
Yep.
And so I think all through this time, I was a foreign policy nerd, a Fletcher grad, writing speeches and trying to find my way into these conversations and rooms. I got hired by Secretary Clinton, who had a little-known policy director, never to be heard from again, named Jake Sullivan.
Right.
And Jake brought me on to do speech writing for Secretary Clinton and Bill Burns and Tom Nides. But then when the Egyptian Revolution happened, I'd spent my summer at Fletcher in Egypt with some of the folks who were part of those events, and ended up working on the response to the Egyptian Revolution in policy planning. That led me to Joe Biden's team, where I worked for the vice president as a speechwriter and as a Middle East advisor, and then kind of on from there. I left government after the anti-ISIS campaign and had a bunch of meetings. I went to Iraq 5-6 times, went to Najaf, Karbala, Baghdad, northern Iraq, and had a bunch of meetings with the folks that I had been staffing and scheduling phone calls with for Joe Biden in the vice president's office. And one thing led to another, and all of that led me to the Gulf as both the most important region in many ways in the Middle East, and sort of setting a global tenor for the region, and also as a place that was going to be fraught and difficult for democratic foreign policy, where I wanted to kind of put my oar in the water and try to make good things happen. And that was enormously complicated because there were a lot of countervailing forces at work and a lot of things that we knew needed to happen. There were some changes that needed to happen. There were probably a few changes where there was a degree of enthusiasm that was hard to then kind of reconcile to pursuing a very practical and interest-based policy over time. But that was the work, and it led me from think tank world into the administration, where I took the Gulf job at the State Department. And this is a path into being a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau that I think literally no one has ever taken. I wouldn't recommend it. Sometimes people ask me about how I did this, and I joke, you just have to make friends with the person who becomes president and the person who becomes national security advisor. But I think truthfully, I've always been a curious person. I've always tried to go an extra mile to listen to people and to gather information and understand and trust experts and try to use critical intelligence to go from there and take the experience that I have, which others don't, to get somewhere we couldn't get otherwise.
Well, I see a lot of young people, and they kind of think that from age 17, they have to be focused on the job. And, you had a degree in humanities, in English literature. By the way, Shakespeare's overrated, I think. I saw
these are fighting words.
I saw the Washington Shakespeare production of Romeo and Juliet. He just ripped off West Side Story. Obviously as a speechwriter, that ability to quickly analyze things, as a speechwriter, you're not the master of all this subject, but you have to encompass all of it, make it comprehensible. And that comes from a humanities background, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think a lot of what you're studying when you study humanities one way or another is human nature. What makes people tick? If you want to understand a ruler or an extremist or a national mood, what stories are they telling themselves? How do they shape their own narrative? Not to mention the sort of great Miltonian quote about Satan, where he says Satan suffered from a wounded sense of merit. It's a thing I think about all the time when I'm thinking about, both American politicians and then leaders in the world, and why do they act in ways that surprise people sometimes? And I think you just really can't rule out that human dimension. And Shakespeare, I think, in many ways invented some of the modern concepts of human nature as we understand them today. That's certainly one of the academic arguments. And so I think that being a student of people through words is something that carries over from a diplomatic communique to literature. Ideally, you're telling the truth, but even in telling the truth as a public official, you're shaping a narrative. I think about Dara'iyah in Riyadh, and this idea of how do you tell the story of your country? How do you tell a story about where does Saudi Arabia begin and who began it? And, how do you recast that story, for example, in the case of Dara'iyah, to be more about the Saudi nation and less about a kind of religious bargain? That's all built into, not just real estate and business in the midst of Dara'iyah, but the storytelling of what story is Saudi Arabia telling to itself and the world. And it's just one small example of the ways in which narrative and kind of constructed narrative and how you imagine and reimagine the community that you're part of shapes the life of a nation. And it kind of draws a through line from being a speechwriter to being a policy person. Doesn't mean you don't have to think about really hard and fast material things like interceptor stockpiles or safeguards for microchips. But it's another part of things. It was torture for my desk officers who had to write my remarks. They would tell me what a pain that was.
This doesn't rhyme. Yeah, I can see where that would be an issue. But the analysis that comes with the study of literature, for example, that's deep analysis, it's textual analysis, and particularly in foreign policy where your words are going to be translated and you don't have control over that. So you've got to have a text that is clear. And I think that young people today underlook or underestimate the value of writing clearly and a background in writing clearly at a university level.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think people think AI is going to solve it for them. And it just isn't. And it's just, I can tell every time someone puts something in front of me that has the hallmark ticks of ChatGPT. I think that what writing really is sort of distillate of thinking.
Yeah.
And so part of clear thinking and clear action, usually is expressed in being able to clearly explain what it is you want to do. George Orwell, in his wonderful essay, Politics and the English Language, talks about how politics in his time, and I think about it today, in many ways is the defense of the indefensible. And he describes how these sort of euphemisms and kind of vague and cloudy language then enables either morally dubious or just kind of foggy and unclear policy choices. And so policy and language really can't be so neatly and easily separated in the way that they are in an org chart between communications and policy work. In reality, if you're pursuing a policy that you can't explain in plain English, you've got a problem. Joe Biden used to say to me when I would hand him a speech about a complex topic, he'd say, Danny, and he was probably the only person in the world who called me Danny. He said, Danny, call your aunt. And if she can't understand this, I'm not sure I want to say it. Now, there would be times where you'd have a specialist audience, and that would be different. But clear, succinct language explaining to the public and, frankly, to foreign leaders what you're actually doing and why is an underrated thing. And I think there are real live illustrations, even in this very day that we live in, of what happens when people cannot clearly explain in plain English what it is they're doing and why, that may be a warning sign as to what's going to follow.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let's move to policy a little bit. I think that's what you were expecting. So the war with Iran, we're looking at escalation as a possibility. President Trump said that he held it off. We're also looking at some sort of diplomatic resolution. What are the core strategic and political gaps that prevent Washington and Tehran from coming to an agreement, in your view?
Well, I think we're really stuck. In a lot of ways, you bring it back to human nature and kind of what we need. What do these two political leaders need? If you were an engineer and you were looking at this problem set, you'd say, oh, this is so easy. Look, this is jammed in here and that's stuck there.
Yeah.
And it's very easy. The Iranians need money and they need some guarantee that they won't be hit. And the Americans need a guarantee that there won't be a nuclear weapon and the free flow of commerce. Bing, bing, bang. Here, this goes here. Sanctions relief.
What's wrong with you people? Solve it.
Nuclear issue. You solve it. You find a good solution. Maybe it's not forever. Maybe it's for 30 years or 20 years or 10 years. And then there's strict safeguards. And, but there's problems on both sides of this because they're sort of human beings. And again, you have on one side, the descendants and followers of Ayatollah Khomeini who said, I didn't do this revolution to affect the price of watermelons.
Right.
And on the other side of it, you have another set of psychological and political needs to do something that his predecessors for Donald Trump couldn't do. So I think there is probably a deal that would no one would love it, but everyone could live another day if they had it. But right now, I think the Iranian side feels that they're winning because they've closed the strait and they've kind of taken command of the global economy and disrupted everybody and disrupted the American voter ahead of our elections. The U.S. side, I think, thinks it's got this counter blockade and such military dominance. How can it not bring to heel a lesser foe? And I think that psychological gap where both sides need to say, this has gone, in some ways we've had some successes, in other ways we've had some real failures and setbacks. And now we need to come to something practical instead of just teaching the other side a lesson or thinking we can force our will. I think that's where we are. Now, you could see escalation from here. You could see a deal, or I think most likely of all, you could see a version of kind of choppy stasis. Those are all possibilities. But the core problem, I think, is the political needs of the various sides and the perceptions of the various sides that they're teaching each other a lesson. I think they're kind of competitively each holding their breath to see who passes out first. I had a Middle Eastern friend in the Gulf whose economy is blockaded tell me 3 minutes is a very short time unless you're underwater. And I think that's the case for both sides strategically in different ways.
Yeah, when you box, 3 minutes is the longest period of your life.
Exactly.
After the war, GCC-Iran relations, how do they come back from this?
It's so interesting. You talk to folks in the Gulf, strategic thinkers, government officials, experts, and I think in a lot of ways, they're soul searching about what to do next. And it's just not easy. I mean, I think, especially the big Gulf states, you basically had a kind of four-legged stool of what they were trying to do here. You had diversification away from oil and gas, globalization to connect their young populations to the world economy, détente with Iran to create enough calm and quiet and space to allow all of that to happen. And then all of that backstopped by the U.S. Defense umbrella, which provided deterrence.
Right.
Now, you look at each leg of that stool, and they all have wobbled a good bit. I don't think any of them have snapped, in my personal view.
Right.
But they've all gotten pretty wobbly. And that's why you have people arguing today that the Gulf states should expel the United States and make their own separate peace with Iran, or go to a truly multipolar world, or all of these ideas about what could happen, because the paradigm, the story that the Gulf was telling itself about how it was navigating this moment really collided headfirst with the Trump administration's desire, and frankly, I think in some ways with an Israeli project of conflict with Iran, that basically, taken together, the president's decision and the Israeli decision last summer to initiate this war led to a place where the Gulf's vision of calm and the steps that they'd taken to protect and insulate themselves, which held for 3 years after October 7th.
Yeah.
They really weren't hit at all by Iran, very little until this past spring. That whole process, that whole plan that they laid out for themselves just started taking on water. So they're thinking to themselves, what are we? What are we doing here? What's the project?
Yeah.
And there aren't easy answers. I think that a lot of the alternatives are simply not there, whether it's China and Russia, who just want to sell stuff in the case of China, or are severely constrained in the case of Russia. There's the idea of this sort of Mark Carneyism, where you go looking for other partners, and the other partners are valuable, and many of them are genuine value added, from Israel to Ukraine to India to France. But they're kind of a garnish rather than the main dish when it comes to defense or AI or some of these other cutting edge technologies. Gulf solidarity could be an idea, but the fact is that the Gulf countries have grown further apart rather than closer together because of their differentiated experiences of this war. So I think the U.S. relationship is going to remain a major pillar, and that probably will put some constraints on what happens with Iran. Some Gulf states, I think they really are looking at this in very different terms, in part because Iran hit them all so differently.
Right.
Iran hit the UAE really hard. Half of all the ordnance of drones and missiles from Iran came not at Israel, but at UAE, more than the other Gulf states combined, just about. That led them to the conclusion, I think, that they had to trust in hard power, and that they had to move away from a paradigm of détente to say, hey, we just can't live with these guys. We need to trust in our close friends who have come to defend us in our moment of greatest need. And we don't know how this ends, but we're going to have to figure out how to ratchet up the pressure on Iran. And I think Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait in particular are seeing the world a little differently. Part of it is that Qatar and Kuwait don't have any egress for their natural gas and their oil in Kuwait. But part of it is, I think Saudi looks at this same picture and says, well, we got hit some. We didn't like it. We'll never forget it. But we don't really see an alternative. We don't see that the Iranian regime is going to fall.
Yeah.
And we don't see a path whereby additional military force achieves the political goals of this war at an acceptable cost. We do see that if Iran gets hit again, it will continue its sort of ratcheted up, calibrated ratcheting up of attacking us, attacking our critical infrastructure. And so they're balking at that. And I think they're quietly probably talking to Iran and having their own conversations. So I think there's a lot of friction inside the Gulf. Yeah. There's also going to be a lot of friction with the United States, in part because there isn't really a unified Gulf position to go to Washington on this issue. So they're trying to figure it out. Some of them believe that they have no choice but to go back to a form of détente. They know that it won't prevent them from being hit by Iran, which I think is what they hoped before.
Right.
But they also may look at this situation and say, geography doesn't lie. They're right across the water. We don't like the regime where there are enemies, but there's nothing that we can do to remove them at this time. And so we have to buy time to do the most important thing that we're doing, which is not fighting Iran. It is our domestic development to show that we can build modern, globally connected, dynamic societies that are facing the future. It's the loss of that and that sense of security that I think galls the UAE so much and causes them to think Iran needs to be gone. And it's the prospect of holding on to that, despite the Iranian attacks, that causes the Saudis and others to look for détente.
It's one of the things that I'm really struck by is in President Trump's remarks when he said we were going to attack, and then he cited the individual leaders who said, don't do it, don't do it. I wonder if that's President Trump trying to do them a solid, saying, look, this is just the United States and Israel. Yeah. Leave these guys out of it. Whether it has any effect on the Iranians or not doesn't really matter so much as he can say to the Gulf partners, I did everything I could to keep you out of that.
Yeah, I think so. For the last year and a half that Trump's been here, he's had an excellent relationship with several individual Gulf leaders. He's gone out of his way to flatter them, not to speak negatively about them in public, and just generally to try to build up a kind of warm and constructive public tenor of these relationships. As that's been happening, I think the reality has been, really up until this war when UAE kind of broke differently, that the Gulf states in aggregate were looking for de-escalation with Iran. They were looking for an end to the Gaza war. They were looking mostly for normalization with Syria. Yeah. And they found that as good as their relationships were with the president and his team, and he had that great visit last May where there were 1 million mega deals signed on everything from microchips to defense to airplanes. As good as all that was, they felt like they couldn't always influence him on the issues that mattered most, especially when Israel was pushing in a different direction. Yeah. That Gaza ceasefire lapsed, Gaza closed to humanitarian goods. That was very vexing to them until finally the Israelis bombed in Doha and Trump swung back the other way and imposed a ceasefire. Yeah. On Syria, the Gulf states, and MBS in particular, won and got American engagement and normalization with Ashara, which the Israelis didn't want. And then on Iran twice, Israel was rowing in one direction and the Gulf was rowing in another, and America went against the Gulf leaders' wishes, I think. So that was very frustrating to them, and I think that they have a feeling maybe that our views aren't being heard. And even in some of the specifics as to whether the United States chooses to escalate, when they're the ones on the front lines getting hit in retaliation, I think that feeling runs deep. So I think a text like that has two purposes. It helps the president say, I hear you guys, I value you guys, I can see, and I'm making clear that you all have a different perspective and I respect it. And on the other hand, he also gives himself a way out from a set of military actions against Iran that it's just not really clear to me are going to achieve anything that wasn't achieved in the first round of bombing. Right. He's stuck and he's trying to juice the diplomacy with rhetoric and threats to unstick it. Yeah. But I get the sense that even he now realizes that another round of military strikes, the juice just ain't worth the squeeze. And he'll do it if he has to, but not if he can avoid it.
Well, one of the developments here that was the Strait of Hormuz as being a pressure point for Iran, basically a weapon in Iran's arsenal. And it seems that going forward, they're trying to routinize this to make this a regular thing, equivalent to, say, the Suez Canal, but without international rite of passage. Is this something that we can reverse? Are we going to go back to the way things were before the attacks?
Gosh, I sure hope we can. This is something that America has been doing for 80 years around the world, is policing sea lanes and keeping them open as a global good, in part because it's incredibly beneficial to our own economy and world leadership. And I think that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz really has become, in many ways, the center of gravity of this war. Once the Iranian regime didn't topple and fall, I think that the Hormuz became kind of the center of gravity where this war's outcome in many ways will be determined. I think that this is kind of a weapon of mass destruction for Iran that they can use. It has some very negative effects. I think the administration was wise to impose a counter blockade and probably should have done it sooner to make sure that the rest of the world, including China, feels the pain as much as our trading partners and allies do. The idea that America doesn't need the Strait of Hormuz to be open simply because we have our own domestic oil supply, which in turn is priced globally, is a fantasy. Of course we need it to be open. We're going to talk about a global recession here, global demand destruction, including for the oil that the United States is producing, and basically, our partners' lives and livelihoods on the line. And, it's not a good reflection on U.S. leadership if countries in South Asia have to go to a 4-day work week because of a war that we started and can't end. So I view the opening of the Strait of Hormuz as kind of a pass-fail test for American leadership. We've got to get it done. And I think in many ways it's the most urgent of our various priorities. Iran is not, as far as I can tell, without an active security clearance, enriching uranium at the moment, and hasn't been since last June. So while we all want to lock in the goal of Iran not developing and acquiring a nuclear weapon, I think the most urgent is to return the flow of energy to the global economy, which affects everything from inputs for microchips in our AI race with China to the cost of fertilizer for a farmer in Africa, et cetera, to the price of various goods in America, to the cost of your mortgage. So this is incredibly important stuff. As to whether it can be done, I think yes. I think that, yes, we can come to something with Iran where Iran opens the Strait of Hormuz. But right now, for them, they need a few things in return. They need another source of revenue. This is going to be billions of dollars a year for them. What else are they going to get offered that will be billions of dollars a year? Perhaps they could sell their own oil as part of a larger deal that addresses the nuclear issue. It's going to take money. They're not going to give it up for free. They're not going to give it up, I don't think, militarily, although it's theoretically possible. It seems so difficult because it so favors offense on the ground where a single fast boat can shoot a ship and raise the price of insurance. I think we're going to have to do it diplomatically. It can be done, but it requires concessions. And if you're not willing to make concessions, we may not be willing or able to open the strait in practice. I think we're going to have to do that. And I hope that we, on both sides, can summon the wisdom to get there, because this is really like a basic part of the global operating system.
Yeah. I make the point that it's not really a military problem. You alluded to this. It's more akin to, say, the Tylenol poisoning, where disrupting it, you put cyanide in 2 bottles of Tylenol, and the 4 million bottles in the United States have to come off the shelf. The threshold for disruption is so low that it's very hard to force your way through to a positive solution.
I think that's right. And look, it's possible in the near term that you could have the U.S. Navy escorting a small number of vessels through the strait to try to alleviate the blockage. I mean, and you're also talking about tens of thousands of sailors who have been stuck on these waters and basically stranded there now for months. So on a humanitarian level, it's just awful. I don't think it is a military problem. It's very vexingly difficult to solve. And I think that even if we get an Iranian commitment to open the strait as part of some kind of diplomacy, first of all, that's going to take time, and you're going to need to create a runway to get there with, I think, intermediate agreements and other steps. And that's very hard when you kind of have a culture of impatience and bluster and bravado and deal making. But also Iran will always be able to hold this threat over the countries of the world. You can't unring that bell. They've shown that they can do it. They've taken a theoretical problem and made it a very palpable reality. As I said, you're talking about 4-day work weeks in certain parts of East and South Asia as a result of this, because they can't afford fuel to justify keeping the office open. So, now it's true that China doesn't want that level of demand destruction. They want to sell their widgets everywhere.
Right.
And even if some of those widgets are helping to electrify the world via solar panels and cars, a lot are not. And that kind of global recession and demand destruction will really unite the world against Iran. So this is a kind of diminishing asset in some ways, even if they handle it deftly as they mostly have. So I think again, both sides are going to need to make a deal. And I think that, there's a trite thing in maybe especially the party that I've served under where you say there's no military solution, there's only a diplomatic solution, and it becomes somewhere between sort of catechism and received faith.
It's an article of faith.
Yeah. Right. There are military solutions to some problems. This one is going to require the U.S. military to play a very active and muscular role. But I think that role has got to be creating a diplomatic solution to deal with this, because it's extraordinarily difficult to take that many boats through that much territory, with that much Iranian territory next to that territory, with that many drones and that many missiles that can hide underground, that can hide inside trucks, and expect that you're going to get 100% of them. And if you get 96% of them and 4% of them hit their targets, then this becomes uninsurable, and you have a basic financial problem, and you got to stop.
No, it's the calculus of mining. I mean, basically, once something is mined, you and I say, is it demined? But an engineer will say, well, with a 96% confidence interval to a depth of, and that's just not acceptable for an insurance market.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The U.S. role with the GCC, are they hedging? Are they bandwagoning? Are they looking for alternatives? Do you think that our stature has declined, or are they just saying, well, it's like male pattern baldness. Learn to live with it. What do you think?
Yes.
Okay, moving on.
Look, I think that in many ways there was no Gulf state, as far as I can tell, that really wanted this war.
Yeah.
I don't think they wanted it. I think that this went antithetical to their model. Now, would all of them like to deliver a good punch themselves to Iran for all the things Iran has done to destabilize and threaten them? Absolutely. Would all of them, like to see the Iranian government gone and replaced with some sort of malleable, amiable, not too competitive neighbor? Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, they all would. But I think when they all looked at this, they saw, well, maybe we'll end up with a failed state. But certainly Iran will respond immediately by retaliating against us. And all the things we've been building and risking our lives, in some cases, to build, of a kind of more modern, open, globalized, diversified society, will be put at risk in pretty short order, I think. And what they were afraid of is exactly what happened. That's pretty irritating.
Yeah.
But then I think something happened next that was also quite clarifying and revealing. I think they saw how hard they were hit by Iran, and they realized, look, Iran is our enemy. Who are our friends? Who's going to help us? And the United States showed up, as Anwar Gargash said. The missiles flying over our territory were Iranian, and the partners helping us shoot them down were American. And I think that was a feeling that was felt everywhere. Yeah. The military showed up, the political leadership showed up. They started this war that the Gulf felt was unwise, and in many ways they still don't understand where we're going, to be honest.
Right.
But they knew that Iran was an adversary who was willing to do something like this and had it planned beforehand, willing to attack them all, and that America was willing to show up. That gave us something. However, it didn't give us confidence from the Gulf that we know where we're driving this thing next.
Right.
And it was in Saudi Arabia last week, and my sense is, in general, there's a real question all over the region about where we're driving right now, whether it's to more escalation or to a deal or what. And I think for Gulf countries that don't have the luxury of distance and can't afford to wait and see and can't be the object of an experiment, well, let's see if we tinker with this escalatory step, maybe Iran won't respond. They're feeling every step of this. So they're thinking that they have to take account of their own interests. So some of them will bandwagon together in different ways. I think it was powerful for everybody that Saudi Arabia kind of emerged as a land bridge out from the small trucial states into the rest of the region through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman into India, Indian Ocean. I think basically geography is key here, and there was a whole lot of economic coordination, including between Saudi and the UAE, who these days are seeing the war and the region and the world quite differently, but had a great deal of economic coordination. So I do think that there is some of that, but when push comes to shove, I think America's judgment is being questioned, probably in ways that it wasn't before. How did you get us into this? This has been so damaging for us. You didn't take proper account of our interests. But I think we've also showed up as a kind of indispensable partner, and there's an old story about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where Eve is annoyed at Adam and frustrated with Adam. And Adam looks at her and says, Eve, what's wrong? Is there someone else? I don't think there's anybody else.
Yeah.
So I think there are relations with China and Russia and others, and there's a détente to manage for some with Iran. But I think America is the big game in town, and that's likely to stay that way, even in a more multipolar world and a more multipolar Gulf. So it's that kind of dual vision where you have this big American relationship, and you have the other great powers, and the Quad, and the Abrahamic alignment with India, and France and Korea showing up. So it's a little bit of a crowded margins, but America is kind of not like all these other powers in terms of the way that it plays in this region and how it built up this region and how intermingled, as you know better than I, the militaries are with this region, and now how intermingled our tech sectors are becoming as well as a sort of future area of endeavor that's tying royal courts and Silicon Valley together in the same way that our military and our oil sector tied us together in generations past.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. One thing I'm wondering is, the lack of physical integration of the GCC states. Sometimes it takes a crisis to do that. It is incomprehensible to me that there's not a really consolidated rail network, for example. There's not a train running from Dubai to Abu Dhabi. A high-speed rail from the airports or something. Yeah. Do you think that we might see, people are talking pipelines, to alternate, to the Red Sea or even over directly to the Indian Ocean? Do you think we might see this as an impetus to basically put the scale a little bit on a business case that may not have made sense and overcome some political inertia?
I really do. Look, I think politics has a way of asserting itself in these processes. Yeah. But this is a sort of silly way to put it, but I do think about this. This war cost Qatar $100 billion of oil revenue, and more than that in terms of repair.
Right.
Or gas revenue, excuse me. Yeah. This $100 billion of natural gas revenue is gone. What could we have put $90 billion into? That would have been worthwhile here and made you money. It's the full clarity of hindsight. But the costs for Qatar, for their natural gas, for Kuwait, for their oil exports, and even the money left on the table by Saudi and UAE, who are exporting a good part of the oil that they're able to produce, but not all of it.
Yeah, a fraction.
That adds up really fast to pipelines, roads, rail, trucking, when you talk about the petrochemicals and all the other elements, parallel pipelines to the oil pipelines for other kinds of things. I think that this might be the moment where, even though the Gulf has some deep political fractures in it at the moment, you could see some of those economic projects come to fruition. So I would watch that space closely. There are a lot of them, and there will be competing projects heading in different directions with competing investors. But I expect that the Gulf has already been rewiring itself over the last 3 months in a way that's kind of unprecedented, using these sort of land routes out of the Trucial states to the Red Sea, and using that port capacity of the Red Sea as a kind of lifeline for some of the other states. So I think in 5 years, Gulf infrastructure may look fundamentally different, or in 10 years, 5 to 10 years may look fundamentally different than it does today. But again, we've seen before how a crisis creates a sense of urgency, and then the crisis dissipates and the urgency goes. I'm not sure that this crisis is going to dissipate. So I expect you may have time living in this environment where you see these kinds of projects come to fruition.
Yeah, I sure hope so. The Canadian National Railroad would have never been built except for the Louis Riel uprising in Saskatchewan. And when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police first deployed, they actually had to take a train to Minneapolis and then march from there because there was no way to get across Canada. And this could be one of those moments where
totally. Think about the foresight to build that east-west pipeline 25 years ago. Yeah. That was a lifesaver. Without that thing today, and that's not a recent phenomenon. That's a generation old. And the extent to which the whole world owes the builders of that pipeline a debt these days for not giving us $200 a barrel oil is remarkable. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that people can project forward to that from that in societies that have some of the most patient and strategically directable capital on the entire planet to come up with these things. It's easier said than done in the heat of the moment. But I expect you're going to see some of those things, and it may look fundamentally different.
These are sectors where the industry is technologically advanced, where they're world leaders, and they're not trying to adapt what they get in Europe or the United States. They are world leaders in that. So
no, that's right. I think the counter argument would be if some of them say, you know what, we're so stuck, we just have to find a way to live next to Iran. We don't need to bother with all this stuff if we do that. But I think that's the world they were living in before February 28th. Yeah. And I think that's the UAE's point in pursuing a different approach, is that world is gone. So I think you'll probably have some wishful thinking that we can go back to that world of détente and not expect to see another moment like this. But everything tells me from where we are that we're living in a different world where the Iranian threat to the Gulf is just a much more real and present reality as far as I can project into the near and medium term future.
No, I think you're right. Let's look a little bit at China. They've always had a presence. It's been mostly economic. There's a little bit of security. Some of that may be to send a message to us. Some of that may be, for example, you think of the Saudi armed forces with 155 millimeter howitzers, a way of saying we have options if you decide to embargo weapons sales. Do you see them prospering from this? Or you alluded earlier that they were damaged, that their economic interests are damaged. Are they just watching this? Are they letting us punch ourselves out and indulging in a moment of geostrategic schadenfreude? Or is there some sort of changed approach that you see coming?
You know, I think that it's been interesting to watch how China has been used in the U.S. debate around this war. Everybody in American foreign policy that wants to do something, you know who would love it if we didn't do this?
Yeah,
China.
That's right.
Why are we starting this misbegotten war in Iran? China. It's chess, not checkers.
Yeah,
we're getting rid of all of their partners. Right. Who wins if we don't do this? Or who wins from this war going wrong? It's China. That happens to be true, incidentally, because I think they have taken, we've seen a lot of military capabilities pulled from the Pacific. But I think this war was fundamentally about the Middle East for all the people who were participating in it, all the people who were conceiving of it, and very much about the region itself for the people of the region as they're experiencing it. Now, there is a hope, and I think it borders on fantastical, that China is going to deliver the rest of the region from Iran because they take their oil. I don't see a lot of evidence that China is using that leverage with Iran anything other than very gently. Perhaps if America was willing to make a huge trade and trade away other vital national interests in our defining competition with China in the 21st century, they would be willing to find some way to get it done with Iran. But I think they're probably enjoying watching us punch ourselves out a little bit. They have a pretty good stockpile of oil. But again, as I mentioned earlier, over time, this changes for them because what they're seeing is that demand destruction. You think about those 4-day work weeks that I mentioned in South Asia, and then you're talking about places that aren't buying Chinese widgets and can't afford to take their massively subsidized export juggernaut to absorb all of that in the rest of the world. So over time, they'll want to see this go. They told Trump apparently that they did want to see it go. There's not a lot of evidence of them taking actions that reflect that desire that are hard.
Right.
So China is a major partner to Gulf countries. They're an important strategic player. Gulf countries would be committing malpractice probably if they fully turned their back on China and walked away and severed all ties. But China is really balancing their ties to Iran. They seem to have helped Iran target the United States on Gulf territory, which I'm sure is galling to our Gulf neighbors, even if they are required to our Gulf friends, even if they're required to maintain some kind of a strategic partnership in their minds. I don't think they're terribly impressed with what they've seen from China, either mediating along, helping Pakistan as their kind of, Pakistan is the mediator and China is one of the closest countries to Pakistan.
Yes.
Either in terms of how that has worked for them, I don't think they're terribly impressed. And frankly, what you're seeing really since October 7th is that while the U.S. sometimes makes big swings that don't always land, they're at least in the region and deeply invested. I had this, experience talking to a naval officer during the Houthi campaign, the Biden administration's Houthi campaign, where he described the PLA Navy was in the area for their counter-piracy mission. And here were the Houthis, a non-state actor, acting for all intents and purposes like a pirate organization, storming another boat. I mean, short of, yelling, "Shiver me timbers," this was piracy in action. And what did the PLA Navy boat do? Just watched. They waited. The calls for help came. They never came. They never engaged. They didn't scare off the Houthis. They didn't make any effort to approach the ships. They see, for right or for wrong, the Middle East as a region where there are trade opportunities and there are commercial opportunities and there's oil. But there's also a great risk of entanglement that they're desperate to avoid as they grow in international power and focus on their near abroad in East Asia. I'm no China expert, but I see them playing a very different game. And I think that sometimes in our U.S. discussion, it's very easy to inflate them and to inflate their role in China as our opposite, so that everything that we don't do, they'll do. But, even Liberation Day, it was striking. They were so wrong-footed. We gave them this sterling opportunity to deepen their trade with the rest of the world, and they took it to some extent, but they were alienated from Europe over Ukraine. They were alienated from East Asia over their actions in the Pacific waters. And so our feeling that China will take every inch of ground that we give up was kind of belied by the fact that they're a country with their own serious limitations and constraints, and sometimes their own sense of restraint in the world in ways that we might not expect.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a good point, and the speechwriter in you comes through. China as a rhetorical device to advance whatever policy position you're trying to do. It's almost become a trope, but unfortunately, I don't think it's recognized by people unless they very closely look at the language.
And sometimes it's true. There are things that if you don't do, China will be delighted to do.
Yeah,
and I certainly see that in the Gulf region where I worked so closely. If you don't sell certain kinds of drones or other things, China will step in and do it.
Yeah, or Russia.
Or Russia. And so, or France. And frankly, for the United States, if France is willing to do it, if we have a good reason not to, that might be fine. But China might be something slightly different.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Let's go back a little bit since we're talking about tropes, to the art of speechwriting, which is an art. You'd mentioned AI and how you can see AI in people writing. What are the limitations of that? These are one of these things that people are saying, oh yeah, paralegals, speechwriting coders, these will all be eliminated. But what are the benefits of being an educated person with a background and a practice in writing and analysis that AI can't touch?
AI is just getting started, so maybe in time it'll grow from being like a poor speechwriter, sort of junior speechwriter whose work you have to rewrite, to being something that competes with the giants in the field. But right now, what I see is that it's kind of garbage in and garbage out a lot of the time. What you need to do is provide, as a speechwriter, judgment, listening, a kind of empathy for the person that you're working for, to understand their voice and kind of how their voice works, much more than just sort of choosing the right words. You're really trying to assemble a worldview, an argument, a sensibility, and a way of connecting across cultures. And I find that when I'm looking at kind of thin AI gruel, there's a lot of rhetoric, and then it just says something, and then you begin to pick at what it says, and you find that it doesn't really understand. And of course it doesn't understand, because it's an algorithm sort of auto-completing the words one after another, what you're doing. And it's not this, it's that. A series of one-word sentence adjectives, one after another. It's oversimple, indirect, confusing, opaque. These are the sort of AI ticks. And you find them, and I think people have begun to really mistrust them. And so the most fundamental goal of language, which is kind of authentic communication, is actually getting hoisted up by the fact that people are beginning to feel that the language served to them is not human. So actually, in some ways, a more imperfect, rough-hewn, but kind of thoughtful perspective goes further. And I think it's really, when you step back from it, that sense of judgment that a person can bring to this, that an AI can't. I remember reading something that an AI had written, and it said, after this war, the Gulf economies matter even more than ever before. And I'm thinking to myself, matter more to who? They matter just the same to the people who live there. And it's the kind of thing that sounds like it makes sense, and it sort of leads you into this larger climate of truthiness and general sort of ersatz commentary that gets back to what George Orwell was so worried about, which is where fuzzy words kind of enable indefensible policies and bad, unclear thinking, and that sort of vicious loop takes hold. So AI is helpful. AI is fun, ranging from party trick to efficiency gain. But for speech writing, there's no substitute at this moment for human judgment.
I agree with that. Well, thank you, Dan, or if I can take President Biden's place, Danny. This has been Oasis for the Gulf International Forum. Like and follow us on your social media. We will have another guest next week, but until that time, please take time to research our speakers. We've made references to things that might be worth reading. Feel free to follow up on that. If you want to send us questions, you always can. I'm Dave DeRoche, and we'll see you next week at the Oasis.